If you're an OG Bleach fan, then you probably remember the dark days, when everybody was shitting on the series, and we were fighting for dear life trying to beat the fill of allegations. But over the past few years, I think it is safe to say that Bleach has almost fully reclaimed its old reputation. With new fans discovering the series every day, this masterpiece is finally getting back the love it has always deserved. However, despite the resurgence in popularity the series has seen recently, I feel like the old arguments that once plagued the series and ruined its reputation have never got a proper pushback, and in my opinion, it's only a matter of time once the 1000-year Blood War anime comes to an end before we start hearing the same nonsensical takes all over again. And that's why I've decided to drop this video to try to clear the series name of any unjustified slander it has received or will receive once the hype dies down. And just a real quick disclaimer, by the way, if you don't like Bleach, it's fine. I'm not here to tell you what to like and what not to like. All I'm here to do is break down whatever objectively wrong arguments about the series and explain why I think this series is not anywhere near as bad as some make it out to be with just facts. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. Starting with one of the most important aspects of any series and one of the most criticized aspects of Bleach, the story. I've personally heard all sorts of crazy takes about Bleach's story, ranging from it's bland, repetitive, it's mediocre at best, or it doesn't have a story at all. And I think there are several reasons why people end up with this perception, but if I had to boil it down, I would say it mostly comes from two key factors. Bleach's story is unique, and arguably it's a lot harder to market to a broad audience compared to most popular shonen. What I mean by this is, Bleach is not the kind of series where you can fully grasp the core of its narrative just by reading the first 200, heck even 300 chapters. Sure, they are more than enough to hook you, but you won't get anywhere near the full picture. In my opinion, Bleach is one of those series that you truly start to appreciate on a rewatch, especially if you're paying close attention to the subtle details and foreshadowing. To put this into perspective, let's compare it to its peers in the big three, One Piece and Naruto. It's no secret that both One Piece and Naruto explore deep and complex themes just like Bleach, but unlike Bleach, they are significantly more popular and generally speaking, receive significantly more praise for their writing. That praise, however, does not always correlate directly with the actual writing quality. Having fully watched One Piece and the OG Naruto, I can confidently say that all three series are comparable when it comes to writing quality. But even if we were to assume for the sake of argument that One Piece and Naruto have better writing than Bleach, I still don't think the difference is big enough to justify the massive gap in recognition and praise they get. In my opinion, one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason One Piece and Naruto tend to get more credit for their storytelling is because they follow a more straightforward plot-driven structure that is easier to market and easier for audience to get attached to. As even if you were to ignore their deeper, more complex themes, they would still work as a classic goal-driven adventures that keep people hooked on the journey alone. Bleach, on the other hand, leans far more into character-driven storytelling, more on that later, and that kind of narrative is not as immediately accessible or easy to digest, especially for younger viewers, casual anime fans, or those who prefer more direct, conventional storytelling. To make this point clearer, let me use an analogy. When you're watching the big three, it's kind of like looking at a massive, beautiful canvas, but you're only shown a small chunk at a time. With Bleach, if you're only seeing that one part, for most people it is decent or good enough, but for a significant chunk of people it might seem a bit mediocre or directionless at first glance, hence the all style no substance notion. With One Piece and Naruto though, even if you don't have the full picture yet, the part you do see already looks good for most people because you've got a clear journey to follow and something to latch onto, like watching Luffy's pursuit to become the Pirate King or relating to Naruto because neither of you was loved as a child or got any girls, though unlike Naruto, it's highly unlikely that you will ever reach this milestone. Bleach, however, does not have that kind of journey or a clear end goal that everything built toward. So if you don't pay close attention to the details of the storytelling went over your head, or you didn't stick around long enough to see how all the plot threads connect, then what are you supposed to enjoy or get attached to? Fucking Yorichi's feet. What I'm trying to say is, just because Bleach doesn't follow a straightforward plot-driven structure or have a clearly defined end goal doesn't mean it lacks a story. Bleach's narrative is less about chasing a singular destination and more about exploring its world, its themes, and the individual character arcs that all interweave to form a larger picture. Because, as I said earlier, it is heavily character-driven rather than plot-driven. Speaking of which, this brings me to the second major reason why Bleach's writing does not get the love it deserves from most shonen fans. And that's because, while Bleach is very much a shonen with a lot of shonen elements present, heck, it even is the inspiration to most modern successful shonen. When it comes to writing, it does have a lot of mainstream seinen traits. Take Vinland Saga as an example. Unlike what the name might suggest, Vinland Saga is not about Thorfinn trying to find a majestic place called Vinland to build a utopia or whatever, but rather it's about Thorfinn's personal journey. It dives into deeper themes like revenge, redemption, inner peace, etc., and how all of these themes interweave to form the full story. It's about someone who realizes that life is more than just getting revenge. His ideology, alongside the ideologies of characters like Ashilat, Knut, and even Svein, are all equally important to the story. Take any of them out, and the whole thing would feel incomplete. And you can apply the same principle to Bleach, to Ichigo, Ohara, Aizen, and the rest of the cast. Bleach's story is not about Ichigo trying to bag Orihime, have a child with her, and start bleaching all over us, though honestly this would have been a pretty enjoyable plot as well. But I digress. The OG Bleach was literally a chess match between Urahara and Aizen, a clash of ideologies, with each one of them standing for completely different things, driven by completely different goals and motives. And the thing is, you can't even fully grasp what they are about without understanding the world itself, how it operates, how it was built, and all the layers behind it, which is what is explored in Thousand Year Blood War arc and the novels through characters like Yuha, the Soul King, the Zero Division, and the novels. I could honestly go on about this for hours, but I'm not here to summarize the entire plot, so yeah, let's just move on. My whole point is this: because of the way Bleach's story is told and how certain things are explained, a lot of it flies over people's heads, especially modern shonen fans that are used to brain masturbation like soul leveling, for example. And that's where most of the misinterpretations come from, and ultimately it is what fuels the unjustified hate toward its story and writing. Before I end this segment of the video, I need to quickly address some kinda related takes that I've seen thrown around, like Bleach has repetitive plot, it falls off after the Soul Society, Ichigo's a boring main character, or it is the most dropped anime, for a reason. Think about some of these takes as, you don't even need to watch my video to debunk them, just watch the actual show or at the very least stop believing every piece of misinfo you see on social media. What really grinds my gears though, is that these takes, especially the Bleach has repetitive plot, almost always come from One Piece fans. Like bro, your entire show is Luffy and the crew landing on an island beating the big bad and sprinkling in a bajillion Sanji nosebleeds every time he sees a miner. Let's not pretend that's the pinnacle of storytelling. No, obviously I'm trolling for the most part, but that's exactly the point. Oversimplifying any manga's plot like I just did completely ignores the narrative context, character growth, and world building that happens within those structures. And if you haven't even finished the goddamn story, yes, it is going to sound lazy, repetitive, or lacks development. So go watch any arc after the Soul Society and tell me what major similarities they actually share aside from Wake Mundo also being a rescue arc. The structure, the development, the themes, the plot, the main objectives of the arc are completely different. Also, I think the whole Bleach fell off after the Soul Society notion mostly comes from people who either watched the Bound arc right after, those who despise the Aranker saga, or people referring to the manga ending. Let's start with the Bound arc. In case you didn't know, it is not canon and has absolutely nothing to do with the actual story. And honestly, if you fell for that,
you should kill yourself now!
No, I'm kidding. But even piracy websites tell you what is filler and what isn't. And even if it doesn't, a simple Google search would have solved the entire problem. There is zero excuses for watching trash non-canon material in 2025 and blaming it on the series. That's 100% on you. It's not even a criticism. As for the Aranker saga, now this might sound a little controversial to some die-hard Bleach fans, but hear me out. There are a lot of valid arguments against the Aranker saga, especially in the anime, and I think it is not ridiculous at all to say that the Aranker saga is easily weaker in multiple aspects than both the Soul Society and Thousand Year Blood War. The biggest issues for me with the Aranker saga were the pacing, the comically long fights that often followed a similar formula. At one point, the sense of threat was entirely eliminated, and the scoop ballooning so much that it left room for plenty of mediocre episodes focused on characters we didn't really care about. So at least for me, it is understandable to some extent why would some people hate on it and refuse to continue watching. I personally think the part where Ichigo and his friends stormed into Wake Mundo and started fighting NPCs is bottom 1 episodes of all time. That being said, this is not an argument against the series as a whole, but rather a criticism to how an arc of the series was handled, especially in the anime, as it wasn't as bad in the manga. Remember, the argument here is, whatever came after the Soul Society, which is the majority of the series, was mostly or entirely bad, thus it is not worth watching. And that's just objectively not true. Some downs in one massive saga that is actually 4 arcs combined does not mean Bleach fell off entirely after the Soul Society or that Kubo did not know what he was doing, especially considering that not only was the majority of the Aranker saga pretty good, it literally has the best fights in the OG Bleach as well as peak writing, for example Ulquiorra and Aizen's conclusions. But also, the Thousand Year Blood War, which is arguably the best arc in the series and my personal favorite, comes later after the Soul Society. How anyone can still claim Bleach fell off after the Soul Society is beyond me. Even if the Aranker saga had been the worst shit ever made, I would have watched it just for the sake of getting to the Thousand Year Blood War arc. And speaking of Thousand Year Blood War, the ending in particular, it doesn't even make sense right now to criticize the series based on the manga's ending because we're literally waiting to see how it's going to be handled in the anime, as the anime is now the canon. So there is really no point in arguing about it, let's just see how it plays out. As for the other 2 arguments, I think the Ichigo is boring take really isn't that deep. Shonen fans generally gravitate toward active main characters with big goals, and just to be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that type of character, but generally speaking, it is easier for the average viewer to get attached to them, and Ichigo just isn't one of those. On top of that, you really need to at least get to the Blade is Me chapter or episode to fully appreciate this character writing. Let's be honest, most people hating on Ichigo probably didn't even get past the Soul Society, so I'm not even surprised he gets a lot of hate. And last but not least, Bleach is the most dropped anime. I just need to get this off my chest. This is hands down the dumbest take I've ever heard in my entire fucking life. Like, it is so wrong on so many levels, I don't even know where to start. First of all, there is no definitive or accurate way to determine which anime is the most dropped, but if we're talking sheer numbers, then logically it has to be something like One Piece, Naruto, or Dragon Ball, simply because they are so popular that almost every anime fan has at least tried watching them. There is no way in hell Bleach has been more dropped than those. Now, if we're talking drop rate, that's a whole different discussion. Again, it's borderline impossible to get accurate stats on that either, but if I had to guess, it's probably something like Sword Art Online, Tokyo Ghoul, Berserk, The Seven Deadly Frames, The Promised Neverland, or fucking Boruto. Animes that got so popular at one point, but fell off so hard that most of their fans couldn't finish them. Once again, there is no way to be certain about which series has the highest drop rate, but what I'm sure about is that there is no way in hell Bleach can rank anywhere near the top 5 for either of these lists, if we're being logical. With that out of the way, I'm pretty sure when people repeat this most dropped nonsense, they are talking specifically about my anime list stats. And first of all, fuck my anime list. If you think this site reflects any kind of accurate information, you're delusional to say the absolute least. Just take a look at their most popular anime list. Yeah, enough said. Also, fun fact, according to my anime list's own data, Bleach isn't even the most dropped, not by sheer numbers or by percentage. So I don't even know where this claim comes from. Maybe it is something from the past where Bleach was the least favorite out of the very famous animes, hence the most dropped statistically, but even when looking at discussions back then, it seems that Naruto was more dropped back in the day, despite being more loved overall, which is in line with my conclusion earlier. And even if we blindly accept this fact, it still means nothing. A show can be great and still have high drop rate due to stuff like filler, which Bleach has a lot of, or because it was popular enough to be judged by casual viewers who do not prefer this genre, or simply because, let's be real, Bleach has received a ridiculous amount of unjustified slander for years, which probably affected people's willingness to even give it a proper chance. So yeah, do not judge the series based on what the internet says, try it for yourself and form your own opinion. For the sake of not repeating myself, I've previously made a video about this topic, so I'm gonna link it down below in case you needed an in-depth discussion about it. For this video though, I'm focusing on debunking the Bleach power scaling is inconsistent notion, as in, the characters are as strong as the author wants them to be, there's no way to know how strong anyone actually is or who would win in a fight, it's all over the place and makes the fights predictable and boring. And just to name a couple of examples I've seen thrown around, ones I'll use to show how flawed the logic behind this conclusion really is. For example, we have Mayuri and Oryu fight in the Society, and almost any fight statement or feat involving Ichigo. On surface level, you will notice a recurring theme between all of these examples. Take Oryu, he beats Mayuri in the Society arc, but then despite having Renji's help, loses to an Espada who ends up being easily defeated by the same guy Oryu himself defeated 2 arcs earlier. Take Ichigo, he's always seemingly just as strong as his opponent. In the Society, he fights the Gate Guard and barely beats him. He fights a Lieutenant and barely beats him. He fights a very strong Captain and barely ties with him. And with White's help, he barely beats Byakuya as that point of the story is even weaker than Zaraki. And then after the Society arc, Ichigo proceeds to lose to weaker opponents, which are Base Grimmjow and Olikyora. And lastly, Society Ichigo blocking the Sokyoko with one hand, even though it was stated to be able to overwhelm anything in existence. When I put it like this, it seems as if the claim is actually valid. The power scale in Bleach is very inconsistent or even non-existent sometimes. But on closer inspection, there are 3 massive issues with this logic. The first one is, and I've talked about this before, but some people assume just because character A beat character B and character B beat character C, this means character A can and should be able to beat character C. The second issue is, despite Bleach almost always providing an implicit or explicit explanation for why things happen, people still treat power scaling as if it is some abstract concept completely disconnected from the rest of the story. Not only do they ignore the narrative and its themes or show skepticism towards statements from Kubo himself, but they also completely overlook the context in which things happen, characters or conditions, mental states, hacks abilities, disadvantageous matchups, narrative setups, and foreshadowing. And the last major issue is, some people straight up misunderstand stuff or make up their own headcanons, and since the series' power scaling reputation is already terrible, they do not look for an actual explanation and just assume their misunderstanding is in fact correct, resulting in a self-sustaining cycle of bullshit being spread about the series' power scaling. If you go back to the examples I mentioned earlier, you'll notice that once you dissect each one of them, you'll find at least one of these issues if not all of them. In the Oryu vs Mayuri fight, Oryu did not beat Mayuri under normal circumstances, he used Queen's last style, one-time technique that massively boosts his power. That's literally the only reason he beat Mayuri. In Weikomundo, Oryu no longer has access to that technique, meaning Weikomundo Oryu is objectively far weaker than Society Oryu that beat Mayuri. This is not even an inconsistency, a weaker version of Oryu that would 100% lose to Society Mayuri lost to someone that is slightly weaker than Mayuri and stronger than Oryu. On top of that, Suzail analyzed Oryu's Ryatsu, which helped him negate attacks and even reduce the damage of the ones he could not fully block. And sure, Oryu had Renji's help, but Renji himself was not fighting with full power because he could not fully use his Bankai in that fight, There's nothing really deep about how they lost in this encounter. Wakamundo Uryu and Shikai Renji are weaker than Soul Society last style Uryu, so it is not ridiculous or inconsistent at all for them to lose in a disadvantageous encounter against, once again, someone who is objectively stronger than them, has almost as much hacks and prep as Mayuri, and is barely weaker than Mayuri. And even if we arbitrarily assume that they were indeed stronger as in have more raw power than him, raw power is rarely the decisive factor in Bleach. For example, Mayuri and Nemo, despite lacking destructive power, are one of the few who can actually beat Bernida because of his crazy hacks abilities. Pair someone who only relies on raw power like Zaraki and who will end up losing. The point is, while power levels can be a good indicator of who might win in a fight, they are never the only factor, and in Bleach, they are not even a particularly reliable factor at all. Moving on to Ichigo, this might sound crazy, but Ichigo's power being inconsistent is what actually makes both his power scaling and his character writing consistent. I've talked about this in more detail in another video, so make sure to check that one out. But basically, Ichigo's powers did not grow in a linear manner, especially before the 1000-Year Blood War arc. That's why when Ichigo beats a strong opponent in one arc and then loses to a weaker one in the next arc, it's not actually a power scaling inconsistency, but rather his power level at that given moment is not the same as it was in the previous fight. His power levels throughout the series were inconsistent. That's exactly the point. Kupo literally shows and tells us this. Olikura himself acknowledges during their first fight that Ichigo's power fluctuates massively. And the reason for that fluctuation throughout the series is that Ichigo's true potential was either being suppressed by Old Man Zangetsu and or by Ichigo himself, either consciously or subconsciously suppressing his actual Zanpakuto and Holo powers, which make up the bulk of his strength, in addition to the substitute Soul Reaper badge that according to Genjo was messing with his Ryatsu. When you look at all of this context, even though it is not the full picture, it becomes clear that the way Ichigo's scaling was handled was actually deliberate, consistent, and foreshadowed. The scaling was consistent, but the power levels were not, which ties into some of the most important themes and plot points of Ichigo's journey. He did not understand himself or his powers until much later, and so his powers remained unstable and unpredictable until he finally accepted both his sides. And that's literally how Zanpakuto interacts with its user. Lastly, the Soukyoku feat. If I had $1 for every time someone complained about how the statement makes 0 sense, I'd probably be richer than Kubo himself, which is crazy because I honestly have never thought anything was wrong with it until some of you brought it up in the comments. But here's the thing. There is no contradiction between the Soukyoku being described as something capable of overwhelming anything in existence and Ichigo blocking it. The Soukyoku was using enough power to just execute Rukia. Ichigo then blocked that weak-ass attack. Soukyoku then backed away and started charging an attack strong enough to kill both Ichigo and Rukia. But ultimately, Okitake and Shinsui intervened and sealed it. So it's not like that version of Ichigo blocked the universe-wiping attack, but rather an attack strong enough to execute a powerless Rukia. Think about it like this. A supercar with a top speed of 300 does not need to go at max speed if it's trying to park. This doesn't mean that the specs are inconsistent or that the car is not actually capable of performing such feat. It is the same with the Soukyoku. The fact it is capable of an overwhelming level of destruction does not mean it was actually exerting that power at the time. It was only using the amount of force necessary to execute Rukia, not to obliterate everything in existence. Because why would it even do that? Why would a weapon specifically designed to protect the Soul Society by executing traitors also destroy everything in existence alongside the Soul Society every time it's used? On a side note, people need to take the author's statement more seriously and stop asking for feats because it literally is their stories. If they said this can do that, then it is true. We do not need to see a feat to believe it. Plot armor is probably the biggest criticism Bleach gets. And for like the 5th time in this video, I've already covered this topic in another video, so if you want in-depth explanations for certain fights, go check it out or just drop a comment and we'll respond to it. For this video though, my claim is simple. Bleach barely has any plot armor, and that's because people's definition of plot armor is completely skewed. Anything that happens in a story happens because the author wants it to, so technically everything happens for the plot. However, something only counts as plot armor or bad writing when the only reason it happened is plot progression. What I mean is, if an event was not hinted at, set up, or does not have any logical or narrative justification within the story, and only happened so that the story can progress, only then it becomes plot armor and bad writing. I won't be going over every single example, but if you apply this definition to all fights in Bleach, I would say probably less than 10% of them are actual plot armor. As for the rest of them, most of those fights get criticized either because people did not like how they ended, or because they completely messed the narrative setup, the foreshadowing, or just did not watch long enough to see the full explanation to why this fight ended that way. For example, Ichigo vs Zaraki. How exactly did Ichigo tie with him? Firstly, he got help from his inner power, something we already knew he had beforehand. That's a clear narrative setup, not plot armor. Secondly, it was implied at the time that his holo power also aided him in that fight, Not only with that power also foreshadowed, but it gets fully explained later during the Blade is Me, where we learned that White was the one aiding Ichigo in battles all along, while Old Man Zangetsu had merely stopped suppressing Ichigo's true power to let him use what he already had in him. And lastly, it is explicitly stated that Zaraki deliberately handicaps himself just to enjoy fights more. And just like Ichigo's situation, this also gets a deeper explanation later in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. So as you can see, this fight does not tick any of the boxes for plot armor, making it narratively consistent. And as crazy as it might sound, just because you don't like the fact that a badass captain who was clearly set up to be one of the strongest lost between quotes to the main character who happened to be a part-time Soul Reaper does not make it plot armor. The same logic also applies to a plethora of other fights, but I'm gonna use Ichigo vs Olikyora, Yamato vs Yuha, and Ichigo vs Grimmjow as examples. Let's start with Ichigo vs Grimmjow. Society Ichigo was stronger than Grimmjow, however the reason he got humiliated in their first encounter is because that version of Ichigo was weaker than his Society self. He was suppressing White even harder, trying to rely only on what he thought was his Soul Reaper power, which ironically ended up suppressing both his actual Soul Reaper power and his hollow powers. But after training with the Vizards and learning to control his mask, he started regaining the strength he had in the Soul Society and slowly began surpassing it throughout the Ranker Saga. So in their final fight, Ichigo was already stronger than Grimmjow. The only reason he was struggling was because he was holding himself back. Orihime was watching, and he knew she still had trauma from when her brother attacked her as a holo, so he could not bring himself to turn into that kind of monster again, even if it meant struggling. But Nil then calls Orihime out, saying it is wrong for her to be scared while Ichigo is putting his life on the line for her sake. That pushes Orihime to overcome her fear, tell Ichigo not to die, and in that moment he stops holding back, embraces his solo powers, and wins. Because he could have won from the start, he was just restraining himself for the very reason I mentioned earlier. It was such a powerful moment of growth for both of them, yet somehow people still label it as power friendship bullshit for God knows why. As for Yamato vs Yuha, I know that this fight in particular is a tough pill to swallow as Yamato was clearly set up to be the GOAT, and seeing him get folded and lectured like that is infuriating at first glance. But when you really think about it, that outcome was to be expected. Yamato relies almost entirely on raw destructive power. On top of that, he lets his anger control him, which makes him an easy target for anyone who plans ahead. Just look at what happened in his fight against Aizen. Yuha knew this fact and knew that he shouldn't be dealing with Yamato head-to-head without deception, and that's why he killed his student to throw him off mentally. He used the double Ganger to drain him and shift his attention before stealing his Bankai to deal the finishing blow without any resistance. On top of that, it is revealed later that Yuha is the son of a godlike being, so it is not ridiculous at all for him to be this strong. The reason people think Yuha has plot armor is because he was introduced seemingly out of nowhere and immediately started folding characters who were previously hyped up at the strongest, but in reality, every one of his victories makes perfect sense. And lastly, Ichigo vs Olikyora. By that point of the story, we already knew that Ichigo had mad potential, so it's only logical to assume that he will get exponentially stronger once he utilizes the power we had already seen a glimpse of in the previous arc. Not only that, but in the first encounter against Olikyora, Olikyora verbatim states that Ichigo is stronger than him, but his power is fluctuating massively, which foreshadows the level of strength Ichigo is capable of and would later be unleashed in their final battle above Las Noches. Even earlier, in the first fight against Grimmjow, Ichigo was getting pounded to say the least, and the moment he started using a fraction of White's power, he landed a strong hit, almost forcing Grimmjow to pull out his Zanpakuto had Tosen not intervened. In chapter 220, in his speech about the king and the horse, White implies that he will take over Ichigo and use him if Ichigo did not crush his enemies, as in couldn't win. Surely, after all of that setup, you would think people would have seen Ichigo pulling something out against Olikyora coming instead of just dying halfway through the series. But no, even to this day I still see complaints about how Ichigo 1 was an asshole. And that's because everyone likes Olikyora and didn't like how he was humiliated by the main character that conveniently transforms every time he's on the verge of death. Speaking of which, this takes us to the last section of this video. I think when people complain about plot armor and even about power scaling, they're often reacting to another underlying issue, which is convenience. Admittedly, Bleach definitely has its fair share of convenient moments that help the story move forward. For example, Aizen killing the cleaner and the Dangai was just so happy to let Ichigo train in the area where time flows faster, ultimately leading to Aizen's defeat. Or the Quincy's time limit running out right after they defeated most of the Goatee 13, conveniently stopping them from finishing the job and killing the survivors. Or Ichigo and his friends not running into any captains who would have straight up killed them during the Society arc. Last but not least, Nanao just so happening to have a sword specifically designed to counter godlike enemies like Lil Baro. I could probably go for 10 more minutes, but you get the point. Whether or not convenience ruined Bleach is up for debate. In my opinion, it didn't. This is one of those things where there is no objective answer. For me, it was tolerable, and that's because every single one of these moments had an in-universe justification, which ultimately is what matters in my opinion. And it's not like this is some unique Bleach problem. This kind of thing exists in pretty much every piece of media we consume. It only becomes a problem when it happens too often, or when a bitch is yelling in your ear about how they didn't like that a character conveniently did this or that. What is funny is seeing people complain about this kind of stuff in Bleach while being fans of other shows that did the exact same thing or sometimes even worse, yet somehow only Bleach gets bashed for shit like that. For example, if we're gonna criticize Bleach because Ichigo survived by turning into a monster after dying, then we also have to criticize Attack on Titan for doing literally the same thing. If we're gonna call the final Gesuga an asshole because it was never explicitly stated that Ichigo is capable of such a transformation, then we should also call out Attack on Titan again when Reiner survived being decapitated because he shifted his consciousness, which as far as I remember, and I might be mistaken, this ability was never mentioned once or implied beforehand. Or in Hunter, when Gon sacrificed himself and was on the verge of death just for an overpowered character to be introduced out of thin air just to save his ass. And there are probably tens of thousands of other examples across anime, games, and TV shows, and that's because it is always easier for creators to conveniently add things instead of writing a whole ass complex storyline for everything they are introducing into a story. It's the same logic you see in games when the main character's weapons or loot just happens to be stuck inside a corpse near the player early on or conveniently placed before a boss fight, for example. The same principle applies to anime. Taking Nao's example, sure, it would have been easy for Kubo and arguably better to explicitly foreshadow that she had such weapon earlier, but then the outcome of that fight would have been way too predictable if it was not executed carefully. Plus, we wouldn't have gotten that emotional flashback that tied her story with Shinsui's. Here, conveniently, getting that weapon might not have been the best way to handle it, but it sure was the easiest. And it's totally fair if you didn't like that. But if you're gonna call that bad writing and complain about it, might as well be consistent with that opinion across all the other media you consume, because almost everyone does the exact same thing. Subscribe, sweet cheeks.